All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first UNWLA book club. And we're very excited that you're here with us today, even though we had to reschedule. Just a quick note that we are recording our meeting, and we're gonna share the link with everybody who registered and who joins. But we're gonna make the part with the discussion with Uilleam publicly available on YouTube. So the whole recording will be available to everybody who registered and who joins, but only the small part of the discussion will go publicly on YouTube. So before we dive in, I just want to say that today is not a lecture and it's not a test. And it doesn't really matter whether you finished Cassandra or you read just a few scenes, even if you're simply here to listen and explore, you are in the right place. And before we officially get started, I want to share some personal reflections. I reread Cassandra, and this is my very short summary. Like, you're a strong, independent woman. You know that your city is doomed. You try to warn your family and those people around you, but the truth is painful and it makes everybody scared and uncomfortable. And instead of coming together and acting on what they know, they turn against you. They call you mad. They treat you as hostile. They call you death sister, and they all think that you deserve it. And it made me wondering how long someone can keep speaking up before they just, stop. And Iryna, I have a question to you. Did Cassandra feel more frustrating or more relatable to you? Did it feel more emotional or intellectual?
And Cassandra is a character that's been with me for, I would say, maybe the last 30, 40 years of my life, because I first read her in Ukrainian school many, many, many eons ago in the previous century. A newspaper, I don't remember which one, I think it may have been the Financial Times, used to have a rubric called rereadings. And
Mm,
the journalist who wrote this rubric would go back and reread books that he had read 20, however many years ago, and kind of weigh them to see if they stood up, if they held
mhm.
up. And Cassandra, and this is probably my sixth or seventh reading of the play, uh, holds up. She holds up incredibly well because there are so many things in it that speak to almost every age. And as we continue our discussion later on, I mean, I'll put in my 2 cents about Cassandra's position on truth and how difficult that is, and how difficult the whole issue of truth, well, not difficult, but how challenging it is to, in our day and age. So Cassandra stands the test of time. And what a cool writer Lesia Ukrainka was to have produced something like this that we're reading 100 years later and still, getting excited about it.
That's true. That's true. And thank you for sharing. And how about we do like a quick one word round with you, all right?
Mhm.
So, in your opinion, Cassandra, is she strong or is she lonely?
She's both. She's
She's
both.
both.
Her strength is her loneliness.
That's true. I was thinking about the same thing and I couldn't just stick with one. What about truth? Is it a gift or a burden?
You've got these questions. My answer is always going to be both, because while she is given this gift, she is also cursed
Yep.
by not having anyone believe in her gift of truth. So can you
Yeah.
imagine knowing what's going to happen and nobody believes you, and you know that everybody's cursed, damn, Troy is going to fall, and nobody will take any precautions to protect their state because they don't believe her.
And that's actually, yeah. And that's actually my third and final question. Troy, is it doomed or in denial?
Again, it's both. Like all great powers, they think that they're invincible. And because, again, Cassandra is the bearer of this truth and they don't believe her, so they are deeply doomed and also deeply in denial.
That's true. That's true. Well, it's time we officially got started, and it actually brings us to our guest because many of the themes, like truth and women voices and power, are exactly what we're gonna try and explore today. Iryna, would you introduce our guest to our audience?
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
with pleasure. Today we're honored and excited to welcome Uilleam Blacker, a literary scholar and translator based at University College London, where he teaches classes on literature and cultures of East and Central Europe. Thanks, Uilleam, for joining us. I also want to point out, I'm kind of really happy that we have several men in today's UNWLA book club launch, because I belong to several book clubs and they're largely female driven. So it's thrilling to have a little bit of testosterone present in our discussion. Thank you for being with us.
That's true. That's
So,
true. Yeah.
yeah. So, William, when did you first encounter Cassandra, and what stood out to you when you encountered this work? Did you react to it intellectually, emotionally? Did you like it?
Uh, First of all, just thanks so much for the invitation to come and speak to you. It's a real honor to be here. Um, I definitely liked it. It's really, I mean, I think Lesia Ukrainka for me is possibly the most interesting Ukrainian writer. I don't know. I mean, there's lots of competition, yeah, but she's definitely up there. And I think, your question about does it connect to you on an intellectual or on an emotional level is in some ways the kind of key to that because she has both. Like she's really someone who is operating on a very sophisticated intellectual level. Just the whole premise of the play. For a writer, a Ukrainian writer at the beginning of the 20th century to sort of think, I'm going to take on one of the great texts of world literature. I'm just going to rewrite it. And I'm going to explore all of those great philosophical problems that people have been thinking about for a couple of thousand years through this story. I'm going to take that on. And I think that's really courageous, and it just shows a real intellectual capacity that she had. But also, she's a writer who's kind of very much interested in, I think, even in the play Cassandra, also the relationship between the intellect and emotion. And the way that Cassandra, for example, the way she gains her knowledge and understands her knowledge, it's partly on an intellectual level, but it's partly also on an intuitive level, on the level of feeling. There's a letter that she wrote to Olga Kobylanska about this, where she described the way that Cassandra doesn't know kind of entirely rationally. She knows kind of irrationally or sort of subconsciously in some ways. And that's something that she struggles with. So this is a long way of saying both. Absolutely. It hits you, I think, on the intellectual level because there are really complicated and deep questions here, which I hope we'll get into, but also the tragedy of the central figure is really affecting, I think. But also in the text itself, we can see that she's exploring both the intellectual and the emotional and how they are in some ways in conflict, in some ways working side by side with one another. So yeah, there's lots to talk about, I think.
Um, I do have one question. Does knowing that Cassandra is a Ukrainian work change how you read it?
I mean, for sure, you when you know something of the context of the work, you you can understand it better. This is kind of one of those big questions at the heart of the study of literature. And, to what extent should we study literature as, a work of art that has a composition that has certain aesthetic qualities, which we can just analyze just on this kind of purely structural kind of aesthetic level. Or even in terms of, the arguments, the ideas put forward within it, we can sort of take them just purely on their own terms, or should we think about art as situated in society, situated in a historical moment, situated in a specific context? and telling us about something. This has been the big the study of literature around about the time that Lesia Ukrainka was writing sort of started to move away from that and think about, when we go towards formalist criticism and so on, we think we're not interested in history or society or politics. We're just purely interested in studying art and how it's made and how it functions. And then by the end of the 20th century, we come back to ideas that are very relevant to Ukraine, like post-colonialism, where art is understood as completely political. So I think reading it and knowing that it's a Ukrainian work and knowing the context of, Ukraine's situation as a victim of imperial aggression repeatedly throughout the centuries does help us to understand it. But I think what's really important about this one and which is absolutely what she was trying to do, is that you can read it not knowing that it's about Ukraine and you can still understand it and it can still be powerful and important to you. Um, and that's a very deliberate choice by Lesia Ukrainka. I think that she was absolutely trying to say to her fellow Ukrainian intellectuals and writers that we can't just constantly be talking about ourselves and our own situation, kind of looking inwards. We have to look out. We have to look towards European culture, to world culture. We have to have these kind of wider horizons and ambitions, aesthetically, philosophically. Think about ourselves as as a culture, as a citizen of the global cultural world. Um, and in that sense, also universalizing the Ukrainian experience. So she's saying to the people who are reading her work, she's saying, we can look to other examples. We're not the first people to go through this. We're not the first people to face these problems. We can look to what others have said and but not only learn, but we can engage, we can rewrite, we can change, we can put our own 2 cents into this conversation and people can perhaps learn from us, which is, why it's so great that this translation has come out, because I think hopefully people will be learning from what a Ukrainian author had to say about these questions.
Well,
Yeah,
so much of Lesia Ukrainka's writing, particularly her dramas, come from the ancient world. They come from Greek myths, which raise universal topics, basically topics of love, hate, premeditation, all sorts of also doom, and all sorts of things, betrayal, and these are things that apply to every civilization, every culture, every nation, and every person. And it seems to me that Lesia Ukrainka was very, very she had a talent for making those universal topics, localizing them to some extent, making them more sort of Ukrainian than ancient. I remember seeing a play in Ukraine in the early 90s, Oderzyma, which is about someone who discovers the Christian faith and how she becomes more Christian than the Christians, kind of a thing, and how people get really, really caught up in these new ideas and so forth. And so, Uilleam, could you maybe speak a little bit to the sort of the universality of the messaging and the localization of the messaging in a play like Cassandra and some of the other works of Lesia?
Yeah, I think it's one of these. This is a really important question, and it comes up a lot in discussions of her work. I mean, it's something that she was criticized for in her own lifetime, by the more kind of populist critics who would say, why are you, how can you call yourself a Ukrainian writer if you're not writing about Ukraine? And most of her plays are not about Ukraine. She
No,
has uh, Forest Song, of course, is absolutely a Ukrainian play, recognizably so. Boyarinya also, although not set exactly in Ukraine, but certainly the context. But most of the others are exactly like you said, it's biblical settings, or it's the ancient world, or it's, the sort of Baroque era of Spain, these kind of things. And I think, yeah, I guess what she's doing is trying to plug Ukrainian culture into this much bigger cultural world. I think it's trying to move away from the idea that we can be sort of entirely self-sufficient culturally. And that culture always exists in this complicated network of influences and ideas and trends, which goes way beyond the borders of any nation. And of course, we can construct a national identity using those things. They don't have to be necessarily in conflict with the national identity, but I think for me, the message is kind of if we want our national culture to be kind of fully fledged, to have all the different levels of intellectual and cultural achievements, to have the necessary depth to kind of last and be to sort of meet the challenges of the modern world, then we have to learn. We have to learn from others, and we have to make that contribution to world culture. So I think she's absolutely she's everything she does is working on this tension between like the universal and the local. But she's definitely one of those who's kind of really pushing us towards the outer limits and towards the universal. Of course, if all of these plays are recognizably saying things that are absolutely crucial for Ukraine. It's not like, Cassandra is, of course, it's completely relevant to Ukrainian situation in her time and in our time. It's very easy to see that, but um, there's an extra kind of power, I think, in saying, I'm going to speak about this by appealing to the cultural authority that lies behind this material. I mean, there was a question of when can we understand this or do we understand it differently if we know it's a Ukrainian author, or do we need to know that it's a Ukrainian author? I mean, I think another question is if we are not so familiar with the Greek mythology, can we understand it? I think that's more of a challenge. I think if you're someone who's never encountered the Iliad or, the story that's behind this, it can be a little bit disorientating, kind of figuring out, remembering who all these people are and how they relate to one another. It's kind of a play that's, and this was a criticism that was aimed at Lesia Ukrainka, that it's a kind of elitist. It's a bit elitist. It requires a certain a level of education. Perhaps requires a certain understanding of the myth before you get to it, before you come to it.
There was a time when the Greek myths were just standard things that you learned in 6th and 7th grade in the American education system. So
yeah, I mean, and
Well,
it applies
they
to us as
still
well.
do.
Yeah.
really? Okay,
Yes,
good.
they still do. Um, one of the central parts and one of the central ideas in the play is Cassandra's curse. How do you interpret it today? I'm sorry, as fate, power, punishment, or something else? So again, is knowing the truth a gift or a burden?
I mean, I would agree with what Iryna said before. It's definitely both. And I mean, the story, the origin story of Cassandra is also kind of interesting in that regard. And this is not part of the play itself, but and maybe some of us on the call know, maybe not everybody knows, but how Cassandra gained her gift of prophecy in the myth. She gained it because the god Apollo fell in love with her, and she was a mortal woman. And she refused his advances, but then she kind of eventually, after he was very persistent, let's say, she capitulates and says, "Okay, but as long as you give me the gift of, seeing the future, which is kind of one of the things that he's responsible for as a god." Um, and he gives her the gift, but then she changes her mind. So she in a sense she fools him.
Mhm.
And so as a vengeance to for that, he curses her by saying, "Okay, you have the gift. I can't take it back from you, but you won't be believed." And also part of the curse was I believe that you will also doubt yourself. And I think it's very interesting that we can talk about the gender dynamics of the play itself and the way it's particularly a woman's voice which is not trusted and not heard. But even the origins of this story have this very interesting gender dynamic whereby it's all comes out of this kind of power relation between a man and a woman. And a woman who is sort of resisting and trying to outwit this male figure that has power over her, and does so to a certain degree, but with a kind of sting in the tail. Um, so I think it's, and I guess the point of the myth is really to do the same thing that Lesia Ukrainka does, which is to um, teach us about how complicated the truth is and how, that we think that telling the truth is very simple because things are true and things are either true or they're not true. And you should tell the truth. It's a good thing to tell the truth and it's bad to not tell the truth. But, the play is all about how it's really not that simple. It depends who's speaking. It depends who's listening. It depends in what circumstances. Being faithful to the truth can be something which can test your resolve, which can isolate you, which can lead to persecution, all of these kind of things. And she really develops those ideas in a really interesting way here. But I think she also pulls out this kind of, you know, gender dynamic in the myth that's there right in the beginning. But she just kind of develops it, what's already there.
Cassandra is treated in the play very much as a commodity to some extent by her father, by her brothers, in the way that she is sort of forced to accept a marriage that she doesn't want. That was a way of doing things at a certain time. Daughters were a commodity, and they were used to sort of, to build alliances, to gain friends and influence people, that sort of stuff. But taking truth and taking the messaging of truth that Cassandra does and comparing it to another seer in the play, her brother Helenus, who's a terribly cynical person. And there's this great dialogue between the two of them where Cassandra stands by her guns. And for her, the truth is so painful. It wears on her. This burden is literally killing her. And he's just sort of very glib. And he says, well, that's what you get for saying what you're saying. And I tell them what they want to hear. I tell them what my bosses want to hear. And they're happy this way. So I mean, we're living in an era as well where the things that the truth sayers are saying things that a vast majority of the public doesn't want to hear. And so in that regard, I think she was extremely prescient, and she's very modern in this sort of messaging that she raises in this particular play. I mean, do you think, William, that had Cassandra been a male, she would have been treated differently? I mean, I think it seems to me that we have two things going at each other here. Her role as a woman, as a bearer of truth, and then we have the whole issue of truth as a concept, as an idea, as a value. And they're kind of, I don't want to say that they're in battle with one another, but they're kind of, it's on the scale of a sort, her womanhood and the fact that she's a woman and her capacity to bear truth. And then her brother, who's a male, who can tell anybody any piece of bullshit and everybody's going to believe him.
Yeah, and it says a lot about the people who want to believe. It's a real critique of the society. Yeah, I think that, if were Cassandra a man, would she be treated differently? I think for sure. Certainly. Certainly extra expectations are placed upon her, extra scrutiny. And it's also not just what she says, it's also what she does. Like, as you suggested, there is this moment where the question of her marriage to the king who comes to the aid of Troy in exchange for marrying Cassandra. And so here, she's again raising this question, which is absolutely central to women's role in society then, but also in her own time. That women's freedom to make their own choices in lives, women's control over their own what they choose to do in their private lives, what they choose to do with their own bodies. That we see, this is a very clear example of that. And she also, the character really challenges this very, very openly. Even though she kind of again gives in, but she gives in when she knows, she understands that basically he is doomed anyway. I think that in terms of the question of her ability to speak the truth is interesting, I think, in another way also. Because we have this question of the relationship between language and reality. And she says, and people accuse her of, well, this happened because you said it. So it's not that she's foreseeing the future, but they don't know what she sees, what she knows, but they know what she says. And then they know that it happens. So then there's this logic that, well, you made it happen by saying it. And this also is an extremely modern idea. This is something that even in her time had not really been sort of thought through by linguists and philosophers to an extent, but over the following century would be, and that's the relationship between language and discourse and reality. And is reality just a construct constructed in language and discourse? And that's something that's extremely relevant to our day as well, when we have AI, when we have, social media, when we have the ability to present states of affairs in ways which have really very, very tenuous links with the actual events, actual reality. But we can do so through language, through images, through the construction of narratives. And in some ways that brings about those states of affairs. We can take a question of there's a lot of let's say discourse in media about there is tension in society between this group and that group. And the presence of, I don't, not without getting too specific, but the presence of X group of people within our society is a huge problem, and this and that, and look, they commit these crimes and they do these bad things, and they're bad for our society for these reasons. There may have been no tension in actual fact, but because of the media discourse can then create the tension. So we have a political issue that was not there, but can be created through language, through discourse. And this is something that we find in Michel Foucault's philosophy, yeah, much later. So she's in that sense, she's way ahead of her time in thinking about the relationship between language and discourse and reality, and which comes first. And in the play, it is kind of, we can see that we can debate, to what extent the things that she says or the things that others say influence the course of events. Because we know that her comments to King Oenomaus are overheard, and then they come through to his soldiers, and then so maybe the prediction did have a demoralizing effect on the soldiers, and then it influenced reality. Yeah. So we have just this idea of, if a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is such a thing. So she's also raising that event. It's not just about someone being believed or not being believed. It's about a much more complicated relationship between speaking about reality and the reality.
You know what? I'd like to add to that. Oksana Zabushko, prominent Ukrainian author and intellectual, she says that Hellenis is intellectually the most brilliant of Ukrainka's scoundrels. psychologist and a manipulator of collective, of collective consciousness. And the central idea, the central line of this play is that as long as I don't see something or hear something, it's not there. It's like a very infantile approach, and it's very well encouraged by others.
It's the three monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil. You know?
And my question is, what role does denial play in a collective catastrophe?
Well, I mean, I think you don't have to look too far to see
Well, yeah.
the role. I mean, we can think about many examples, but I mean, let's say climate change. This is the facts are all pretty much staring us in the face, but there are still people with a lot of power who say that it's all a hoax, that it doesn't matter, that it's and who discredit the people who say these things, who we have this whole discourse in kind of populist politics, the anti-expert discourse. This was a big thing in the UK for some years. We had a government which seemed to adopt a strategy of discrediting experts. We've had enough of listening to experts. The people know what they want. This kind of idea. So I think that's absolutely what she's trying to get at with Hellenist. And Hellenist, absolutely, and what is great, I think, and this is for me one of the strongest parts of the play, is the dialogue between Cassandra and Hellenist, because who wins that argument actually? It's very hard to say. And I think Lesia Ukrainka, she's a very sophisticated writer. She's not a didactic writer. She is a writer who will present you with very difficult questions, and she will present different points of view. And she's not telling you the answer. She's telling you to figure it out for yourself. And in order to do that, you have to have antagonists who are convincing and maybe even appealing in some ways. And you can absolutely see Hellenist's position. And also, think about the reality. We can think of many examples where his position would be correct. Like people shouldn't know the truth. It's actually bad for them to know the truth. It's going to be harmful. Any state which is at war does not give everybody full access to all the information about what's happening. This is a very relevant example. The Ukrainian government isn't going to tell us all the stats and all the data about exactly what's happening on the front line, for security reasons, but also for reasons of morale. And is that do we think that's a bad idea, that we don't have access to the information, we don't have access to the full truth? It's, I think you can make a strong argument that there are some things that, the population doesn't need to know or shouldn't know. And he is kind of making that argument. He's not making some kind of argument coming from a place of he thinks that he's acting in the best interests of his community.
But at the same time, he's depriving the people of a choice.
Yeah.
He's not giving them freedom of choice in terms of what they believe. And that raises its own problems and issues and questions.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, we see, I guess, in the end, I suppose there is a message in the end, and we see what happens. It turns out that hiding the truth from people didn't help.
Yeah.
It wasn't a solution.
Can we just talk for a little bit about truth, the whole idea of truth? We have now you mentioned language and discourse and reality. We have words now or concepts that somehow characterize our age and our attitude towards truth. So about 5-6 years ago, the Oxford Dictionary coined the phrase post-truth. When Donald Trump was elected to the presidency, in his first term, one of his counselors, what was that blonde's name? I've forgotten. Kellyanne Conway coined the phrase alternative fact. And the Rand Corporation out in California has for the last several years also been talking about something called truth decay. Now, I'm one of those maximalist people. For me, truth is real. It's and it's concrete. Yes, there are nuances and so forth and so on, but there is such a concept as truth, a moral truth, a philosophical truth, a physical truth. How do we look at truth in the context of this play, but also in the context of our age? And the messaging that Cassandra and Lesia Ukrainka are giving to us, you said that it's not clear who wins that argument, Hellenis or Cassandra. So this is an argument and a conversation that I think that humanity is probably having for centuries, if not millennia. And is it possible to win it, or is this just a conversation that will go on forever?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know if it's a problem that we can solve necessarily. It's probably the boring answer is that it depends and it's complicated. Um, yeah, I feel like there is.
But can we speak in can we use the word truth in absolute terms? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? You know, if you haven't read Aquinas and Schopenhauer and everything else.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's it's a big question with many aspects and many dimensions. Um, I mean, I think what I guess what I get from reading the play is it's not so much the dangers of the truth or the dangers of lies. It's more about the dangers of a closed society or a society where access to the public sphere, to the public discourse is controlled and limited. It's it's kind of an argument for freedom of speech, I suppose. Um, so because Cassandra is afraid to speak because she faces public criticism. She faces censure from her own family, which is the ruling family. She faces potentially being punished. So she's afraid to speak. The society is afraid of people speaking, and people are afraid to speak. And that's really, and that's not the same question as what is true and what is not true. Um, it's a question of being able to air ideas even in the face of doubt and even in the face of uncertainty, being able to have them openly discussed in a way that's on a kind of level playing field, in a way that's not where information is not controlled for unclear purposes by people behind the scenes for manipulative reasons. It's a kind of yeah, it's a more ideal kind of public sphere which is open. It's an open society, I suppose. Um, and I think that's very important. It's this idea that we don't necessarily have to be convinced that we know the truth, but we have to be able to have that freedom to explore it and maybe to be wrong, but to have the safety to be in an environment that is tolerant of those things. And that's another thing that, we can, I think she knew very well what that felt like, the way that the Ukrainian kind of literary world in which she operated could be quite fractious and there could be quite harsh criticisms made because obviously the stakes are high. So people are really, there's a real sense of people have to live up to their duties as Ukrainian writers and their duties to the nation, and you could be harshly judged for doing the wrong thing. Um, so she understood what that felt like. But we can also understand, I think, what that feels like in the way that, let's say the way that public discourse happens online. I think a lot of people are afraid to take part in that because of the nature of the online public space, which is on the one hand, yeah, everybody has access to it, but it's a very violent and manipulated place. And it's not a free kind of open public square in the way that it should be, the way that it was imagined, the internet would be. It's very much the opposite. The information is controlled by people behind the scenes who we don't know, who we certainly didn't elect and who we don't know much about. And they manipulate that public space in order to create conflict, because obviously that generates clicks, that generates advertising revenue. That's how these companies make money. So we can, I think that warning is relevant to us today as well in many ways.
Iryna, I do have one more question that I think we can use as a wrap up of this part of the discussion. And I think it's very easy and simple. Do you feel sympathy for Cassandra?
Are you asking me or William?
William.
Of course, yeah, of course, absolutely. She's a very tragic figure. I think she's also kind of, what's interesting is that she is also flawed and nuanced. She doesn't quite understand. She doesn't know what to do. She's not this kind of fearless warrior for truth.
And she's very open in her helplessness.
Yeah, she feels helpless. She feels vulnerable, but she also had these moments where she can really stand up for herself and kind of hold on to her integrity as well. And I think that's a very interesting character to read about. And I felt, I feel a lot of sympathy for a character like that.
I read a book some years ago, also called Cassandra, by an East German writer, Christa Wolf. And I highly recommend it to people who are interested in the character of Cassandra. And it's somewhat similar to Lesia Ukrainka's play, but it's the story of Cassandra as told by herself. And these issues of loneliness, the voice in the wilderness that no one believes, how she's treated after Troy has fallen. It's a very, very compelling book and well worth a read. So I consider this a plug for that particular book. I don't know if it's been translated into Ukrainian, but the English translation is very good. And Christa Wolf is one of my favorite writers. And she, like Lesia Ukrainka, also raises almost the same issues, of truth, of commitment, manipulation, and so forth. So it's quite good. Sister writers, so to speak.